Oh, this must be the podcast.
So by the time I was in my mid-20s, Jerry Falwell had lent me his jet. I had been on Pat Robertson's 700 Club 6 or 7 times. Dr. James Dobson, who founded Focus on the Family radio show, gave away 150,000 copies of a book I wrote called A Time for Anger as a fulfillment for his fundraising. And so I went from this little backwoods commune in Switzerland run by very well-meaning fundamentalist Christians into the big-time American evangelical scene.
Hello, everybody. I have a very interesting guest for you today, Frank Schaeffer.
Frank, F-R-A-N-K, last name Schaeffer, S-C-H-A-E-F-F-E-R.
Frank is a New York Times best-selling author whose most recent book is entitled Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. His approach to religion and politics is unconventional, but this is due to the fact that he helped create today's conventional thinking. Before we get to that, let's start with his unusual upbringing.
Yeah, I was born, my parents are Americans who moved to Europe in 1947 as evangelical/fundamentalist missionaries with a Presbyterian mission group that was working in the bombed out cities of Europe with young people. And they settled in Switzerland for logistical reasons because the Swiss had avoided the Second World War. And so the infrastructure of the train system still worked. So my dad was able to get to Berlin or to Milan or to Paris or to the UK with greater ease from Switzerland than from any of the other countries.
Okay.
And while they were over there, they started a ministry of their own in 1955 called L'Abri, capital L apostrophe capital A-B-R-I, L'Abri Fellowship, which is where I grew up as a child in a small village in Switzerland above the Rhone Valley near the Italian border and Lake Geneva. And in a village where the cows probably outnumbered people 4-1, there were maybe population of under 300 people there at most. And this little ministry they started grew so that by the mid-1960s, when I was just approaching my teenage years, there were backpackers and hitchhikers and people from what was then the beat generation that morphed into the hippie movement who were traveling around Europe, mostly Americans and English people and a lot of English-speaking Europeans as well, who would, to use the vernacular of the time, crash at my parents' ministry and stay for a few nights that might extend into a few weeks. And gradually, my dad developed this reputation, my father being Francis Schaeffer, my mother Edith Schaeffer, as a kind of an intellectual theologian, philosopher who was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian, as he would have described himself, but with an interest in culture, science, philosophy, and especially in art. And so my background was kind of weird because if you had dipped in, say, when I was 14 or 15 to L'Abri Fellowship in, say, 1968 or 67, you would have thought that you were in some sort of 60s hippie commune being run by evangelicals where some of the lectures were Bible studies and the rest were on things like Bob Dylan's poetry or the movies of Ingmar Bergman and Federico Fellini, etc. So it was a very odd childhood in the sense that it was evangelical, it was fundamentalist. In other words, I have a lot in common with, say, preachers' kids raised in small churches, Southern Baptist or otherwise here in America, but with this twist, and that is my parents' intellectual interest that had been stimulated by living in Europe and my dad's interest in art history and culture meant that the kind of people who were coming to L'Abri were, by the late 1960s, not at all to be confused with, say, the sort of people who these days go to Jerry Falwell's College of Liberty University that his son is now running. In other words, they wouldn't have been mistaken for American fundamentalist Christians. I'll give you an example. Timothy Leary, the drug guru who was very influential in the 60s in getting people to take acid to begin with, came to L'Abri for a number of days. I met my wife, Jeannie, when we were teenagers, and she was hitchhiking through Europe with her sister who had come to visit Joan Baez's best friend, who was checking out the ministry to see if Joan Baez would like to visit. So by the late 1960s and early 70s, when my dad started writing books, which became evangelical bestsellers with titles like Escape from Reason and The God Who Was There, I had been raised in a very countercultural environment that fed directly into the Jesus movement. So our typical backpacker who might have stopped by in those days with someone who might as well have been going to an ashram in India as well. This was the time when the Beatles were going to the Maharishi and these kind of things. And the reason I say this is so that you understand that when my dad became very well known within American evangelicalism, and I began in my late teens to tour with him when he would go to evangelical colleges like Wheaton and Gordon and these other institutions and lectured there, I always felt very much like a fish out of water. The vibe that my dad brought to his lectures, which were on philosophy and theology and so forth, were very far away from what most evangelicals, say Billy Graham, who, by the way, I knew well and would come to L'Abri from time to time with his family when I was in my teens, were preaching. So my dad was not preaching the, quote, simple gospel, Jesus saves. It was basically Christianity is a worldview and a philosophy that gives us a basis in our view of politics and art and life and relationships that is better than other philosophies. And yes, Jesus died for your sins, but it's a lot bigger issue than that. So fast forward into the early 70s, after Roe v. Wade, Dad got known for a film series that I directed called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which we made with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was the Surgeon-in-Chief at Philadelphia Children's Hospital and then became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General.
Right.
And the success of that series really led to what most people acknowledge was the beginning of the Protestant involvement in the so-called pro-life movement, which then became the kind of most deeply rooted, agitated, angry part of the culture wars, feeding into the anti-gay movement, this kind of thing. And we were there at the beginnings, just as it began to become part of the whole Republican Party and part of the politics as we know now.
I've long known that President Carter and his sister were part of the evangelical movement in the 1970s, but the religious right was firmly identified with the Republican Party by the 1980s, and I was hoping Frank could help shed some light on how this all played out.
Well, there's a lot of things that wove together at that point. You know, a lot of the beginning of the religious right started in reaction to integration. And these people were Southern racists, like Jerry Falwell Sr., who was a segregationist and took a, quote, stand on segregation of races, and then later changed his position and adopted the anti-abortion movement as something through which to raise funds and gain influence and change politics as a means after integration became a fait accompli. And the IRS ruled against Bob Jones University and other places that were trying to hold out for religious exemption while being racist, segregated institutions. So when that kind of attempt to keep America segregated fell apart for Southern evangelicals, other issues came to the fore. But it was about the same thing, which was a quest for relevance and power, fundraising ability, and a rollback of what they regarded as a permissive society. We got in at that point. And so my memory of the beginnings of the religious right are less to do with segregation, because for a start, my parents were not racist. Races of all, from all origins across the world were welcomed all the time through my childhood in L'Abri. We had Africans there, African Americans, Asian people, all the time. Mm-hmm. My dad was performing some interracial weddings back in the late 50s and early 60s when a lot of white pastors would not have done that. So that, in our background, our contribution, as it were, to the rise of the religious right was focused very much on the human life issues, particularly abortion. But the people we were working with in order to spread that message had a completely different and wider agenda. They were actively trying to coerce the Republican Party into becoming the political party of the right-wing evangelical movement. And the Republicans, conversely, that we knew were very happy to accept the votes of this new voting swath. So I'd say the tail end of the Southern attempt to maintain segregation dovetailed very neatly with the beginning of the social and cultural wars that we helped launch, which have now morphed into anti-gay marriage and all the rest of it. But at the beginning were more of a backlash against feminism and trying to curtail what were regarded as new women's rights, women outside of the home working, access to abortion and contraceptives and so forth, that shocked the sensibilities of a lot of more traditionally conservative people. That's where we kind of came in. Jimmy Carter was an anomaly. He really doesn't fit that path at all. He might be what you could call the last of the old guard, non-politicized, more liberal evangelicals before they were all politicized. So when we started our crusade against legal abortion with the movie and books, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, people like Carter, even the editorial board of Christianity Today magazine, Billy Graham, others who had been traditional white evangelical Christians said, hey, this isn't our issue. We don't want to get involved in this fight. It's a Roman Catholic issue, et cetera, et cetera. And we had to talk these guys into it. And so really whatever happened to the human race did with Schaeffer, Coop, and my dad as we toured the country and spoke in auditoriums in Dallas and all over the place was to introduce the idea that this was a key issue to evangelicals who at the beginning were reticent and not interested in getting involved. We were the ones that talked them into it. And that's really what Dad's book and Dr. Schaeffer Coop's book did. More than starting the religious right, it was to make it swerve from basically a white Christian school movement, typical of, say, Bob Jones University, but on high schools and other places as well, into something involved in what we now call culture war issues, be that gay rights, feminism, abortion, access to contraceptives, premarital sex, whatever it might be. And, you know, when all of a sudden you have a whole litmus test of social issues, which are now part of the Republican Party platform, we were in at the beginning of that development.
Frank and his father, Francis, felt they were doing good by pushing their religious ideals into the political realm. But he only realized in hindsight that the political realm was pushing back.
You know, when Dad got into the religious right, it was kind of as if he walked into it blindfolded. I mean, we made these film series. We made a first film series called How Should We Then Live, which is still out there, so is Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And both of those had book companions. And the first was on art history and philosophy. And so really had nothing to do with the second series on abortion. By the time we were done that series, we were swept up in what was becoming a political movement that we were both helping to lead and getting carried along with. And so when my dad got cancer and was battling cancer for the last 7 years of his life, essentially what was ironic is he kind of returned to his fundamentalist roots in that it was all about not just the inerrancy of scripture and theological issues, but all about kind of recapturing Christian America and so on. So, for instance, when Michelle Bachmann was interviewed by The New Yorker a couple years ago when she was very much in the news, she was saying, well, the only reason she got into politics to begin with as a student at Oral Roberts University was when she heard my dad speak and read his books. And there would be thousands of more ordinary people across the board like that, and then many, many influential political people, like, for instance, Jack Kemp, the congressman who ran as the vice presidential candidate with Bob Dole. You know, he got into this issue-oriented right-wing politics because of my father, who wound up with my mom and me staying often with Jack Kemp and Joanne, his wife, in Washington, D.C. when he was a congressman. You know, we had these contacts when the Ford family, President Ford was in the White House, for instance. His son, Mike, was at my parents' ministry of L'Abri for a whole year and then went off to seminary. My parents often stayed in the White House with the Fords. We met George Bush Sr. Mom became friends with Betty Ford and would swim in the White House pool and visited her in Palm Springs years later. These contacts were on a very high level. And my father was regarded as a kind of a Christian evangelical philosopher, advisor, guru to a lot of these people. So a lot of his conversations would have been basically philosophical, but when it got to politics, we were part of the movement that essentially captured the religious right for the Republican Party. You'll remember, if you've studied the history, that Ronald Reagan was pro-choice and then changed his views because people like us and Jerry Falwell and others talked to him and said, you're never going to get the evangelical vote unless you come out as pro-life. It was a purely strategic move. So we started that. And, fast forward to the present tense, you've got people like Donald Trump in politics who obviously are nothing to do with the evangelical movement, philosophically, theologically, morally speaking, family values and all the rest of it. But because he has ticked the boxes, as it were, on a litmus test list of things where he says he'll do something about it, say appointing Supreme Court justices they like and this kind of thing on issues like abortion or gay rights and these other things, then all of a sudden, okay, they're so interested in winning politically now that in essence, the evangelicals have given up their original Bible-based family values stands. And so the ultimate irony is that today, the Republican Party, their most shrill base are evangelical Christians who are voting, for people like Donald Trump, who actually in their whole lifestyle and everything they are themselves personally, braggart, liar, womanizer, philanderer, adulterer, thrice married, etc., casino operator, shyster, con man, in one court case after another, of people coming after him to get their bills paid, this kind of thing. To see evangelicals embracing this goes to show me anyway that they have entirely swap places. They are the people who want to win politically now, kind of hanging on to white America and evangelical America. Faith is definitely secondary. The teachings of Jesus Christ, or trying to follow Jesus's example, is third on the list. And so what happened is that, the evangelicals may have corrupted the Republican Party, but the Republican Party returned the favor and got these people absolutely hooked on winning and politics in a way that would have been unthinkable back in the, say, mid-1960s, let alone the 1950s.
Francis died in the mid-'80s after a long battle with cancer, and Frank became more and more uncomfortable with the movement he was caught up in.
Ours was a journey from real integrity and a real desire to, quote-unquote, do the Lord's work, belief that this was the right thing, to realizing that we were on the wrong side of history in a lot of ways. I did. And then theologically, just not buying it anymore. So it was not a scam per se to start out with, but then became part of a wider movement, which was very much of a scam. So it was a wake up and I left. And I think had my dad survived beyond 1984, certainly to the present, he would just absolutely vomit if he thought he had contributed in some way to creating the milieu out of which a Donald Trump comes forth. And he was already sick and tired of just the crassness of people like Pat Robertson, even while he was alive. So I don't think Dad would have bought into the way the religious right developed, and I certainly didn't. I looked at this in my late 20s, realizing that in terms of my marriage, my relationship with my wife and my children, although we were earning quite a bit of money, much more then than I've ever earned since. There's a lot of money in the God business. Not much when you're just writing secular novels the way I do now, or literary nonfiction and doing some blogging and that kind of thing. There's a lot more money in the God business, believe me, and it's much easier to earn a living there. The numbers are huge and so forth. But the fact of the matter is my own life was really coming apart because I just simply did not believe what we were spouting. And I had a choice, which was to live the rest of my life as a hypocrite, not believing what I was selling, as it were, and simply selling it because that's how I earned my living with doubts. Watch my own marriage maybe fall apart under the pressure of living this kind of double life, of just not buying into it anymore. But those doubts started way back in my youth in terms of the basic, is this true questions. They were multiplied when we became major figures in the religious right, and not to put too fine a point on it, we're essentially working with people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Dr. Dobson, who are outright flakes. Real thieves. They obviously get on fine with Donald Trump, say, in the present election cycle, because they're cut from the same piece of cloth. These are just egomaniacal, self-serving people who are into one massive dawn till dusk con job of the American people. In the case of these religious leaders, the people sending the money. In the case of Donald Trump, obviously the whole electorate. So, I had been raised in a fundamentalist mission, but I will say one thing for my parents, as I make very clear in my books. They had a lot of personal integrity. My dad never even had an office in his house. He worked on the edge of his bed, sitting in an old rocking chair. And eventually, when he was churning out books, he got himself a secretary who worked down the hall in another room. Dad never even owned a car, never was flying around first class until people like Jerry Falwell were lending us their jets. This Dad did not amass a fortune. Where I was making money was when I started writing my own evangelical books, trading on the family name. So that's a kind of a long story that I've also told in my memoir, Crazy for God. And the subtitle of the memoir kind of says it, which is how I grew up as one of the elect, helped found the religious right, and lived to take all or almost all of it back. And, that book really not only charts my own life, but tells the story of the rise of the religious right and how it all came about.
Right.
And eventually it was just, look, I just cannot live the rest of my life, so we'll take our chances. And I cut a reel together out of my documentary films and went off to Hollywood and got myself an agent and managed to land 4 directing jobs on second and third rate feature films, but at least I was earning an honest paycheck, and they were actual movies. Nobody was getting conned. They were crap, mind you, but it was a real living. And then I was lucky. I wrote this novel Portofino in the late 80s. It was published in the early 90s, and I've written maybe a dozen books since then. Some have been very successful, others not.
So how did you reach the point of now saying that you're an atheist who believes in God?
Well, I reached that point, I guess, because I've become allergic to labels, which lock you into a life position on something as if it's not a journey. You know, I'll put it a different way. I don't know any Christians or atheists. I only know people who in private are ambivalent, uncertain, change their minds, get older, learn something, don't learn something, but they're never the same as they were when they were 20. So when you get this idea that, you know, people who accept Jesus lock into something they keep for life, you ought to see all the emails from people who are, you know, Zen Buddhists and Roman Catholics and Jews and converts to this or that, or atheists who, you know, at some point in their journey were born again Christians. It just doesn't work that way. Or conversely, people who are atheists today who check in 15 years from now and they're writing evangelical books. They had some sort of salvation experience. What my title, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, is meant to conjure up is an idea that easy labels don't fit. What fits the human condition is paradox. What fits is learning. What fits is growth and journeying. No way to know what direction that's going to go in. I mean, take Billy Graham. Billy Graham is quite liberal and open and tolerant. His son Franklin is a neo-fascist who supports Trump, literally. He's a gay-hating Islamophobe who is really far to the right. I mean, who would figure that? Usually you think the younger person is the one who gets looser than the parent, but in that case, it went the other way. So Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God is really, you know, has to be understood in the light of its subtitle, which is how to give love, create beauty, and find peace. Well, the way you give love, create beauty, and find peace is by not being a certainty addict that shuts everybody down around you who disagrees with you. And what you've got to do is be more open than that and say, look, we're all human primates, and I blink away from being single-celled creatures swimming around in the slime. We just fell out of the trees and learned a little bit about empathy and compassion. And now is no time to stand up on your hind legs and make vast cosmological statements, be that about the existence of God, the divinity of Christ, the, you know, exceptionalism of America and history or anything else, because we're on a learning curve here. And so what I try to point out is that it's not a question of dealing with one's doubts as if they're bad things. It's the opposite. And that is the road to a happy, complete life is to embrace paradox. And I'm not talking just about philosophy here. You know, I'm talking about marriage. I'm talking about love. Jeannie and I have been together 46 years. I have 3 grown kids and 5 grandchildren. And I have friends in the literary and movie business who say to me, how have you done this? As if there was a book you could read or a trick. Or how do you define the word love or what a good marriage is? And let's be honest, you know, sometimes a good marriage is bringing my wife a cup of coffee in bed. Other times it's good sex. Other times it's learning to parent together. But other times it's having a huge fight and one of us leaves and you hear the tires squeal on the driveway. And a couple of days later when we get back together, love that day just means you hate your wife or your wife hates her husband a little less than she would if you didn't love each other. Crazy as that sounds, that's the way real life works. So love is all those things plus a lot more. Well, how much more when you get into issues of God and religion? The fact is sometimes faith means that you don't utterly despair. It isn't because you believe in some theology. It's just there's a little glimmer like an offstage chorus in an opera, which you hear somehow in the distance, which keeps you coming back to the idea, hey, life could be beautiful. It's worthwhile. So I have a very different viewpoint, and that is that paradox is not a problem. It's actually the solution. It's to liberate unknowing in ourselves in a way that actually is a different kind of knowing, but it's a less judgmental kind, and it's one that's open. And so for me, I look at kind of the evidence of God's grace in my life, and I see it in my ability to appreciate beauty and create beauty around me for people in my life. And I'm not talking big deal here, even though I'm a painter. I'm talking about taking care of my 3 grandchildren every day. I have 3 of my 5 grandchildren live across the street, and Jeannie and I are their child caregivers. We pick them up after school, and we take care of Nora. She's 2. And it's the delight of my life. Now, to me, that has a lot more to do with meaning than some theological system where you say, hey, I buy into this. What I buy into is the daily experience of love in your life, of beauty in your life, and not the definitions of those things, but the actual experience of them. And I think that's the difference between, say, where I'm at now at age 64 and where I was, say, 40 years ago.
After all he has seen, I was curious what Frank thought about America today and what our prospects might be in the future.
Well, in terms of putting a timestamp on this interview, we're in the middle of a 2016 election cycle where you have Hillary Clinton on one side of the spectrum and Donald Trump on the other. And I think just looking at how far Donald Trump has gotten, and he's going to lose, but looking at how far he got and the level of support he had really dovetails into something you and I have talked about previous to this conversation, which is your work with conspiracy theorists and rebutting them and so forth. We're living in a time when there is a whole alternative system of information which has nothing to do with truth, but everything to do with ideology, whether it's the birthers with Barack Obama, or whether it is the evangelicals who deny global warming because the oil and coal lobby has told them that, this is no longer something we can believe in because they distrust science and don't believe in evolution. Fox News, constant drip of misinformation for years. The internet has not liberated kind of a new knowledge. It isn't actually doing us that much good in this sense. What it's done is given enclaves of private information that have nothing to do with truth or testing the facts, the ability to become an echo chamber for people who genuinely are uneducated. And I don't mean by that a lack just of university degrees or even college diplomas. I mean, in a more literal sense, have no sense of how the actual world works. So that's one of the problems with all these conspiracy theorists surrounding Donald Trump, talking about, for instance, that the system is rigged. Well, to rig the U.S. electoral system means that hundreds of thousands of librarians and town councils and people who run local elections have somehow been bought and paid for decades before this election to get into place to rig it. It's impossible. It's ridiculous. It's stupider than, talking about extraterrestrials kidnapping people to spaceship and giving them anal probes. This is the stuff of ridiculousness. But millions of Americans either believe or pretend to believe it because they're so disconnected from any sense of how the actual world works and real information. They have not read history. They have no sense of proportion. They don't know anything about art or culture. They are completely cut off from a larger framework. They live in these pockets of misinformation joined together by the internet. So we've got a problem. Now, if that group of people put somebody in the White House or continues to run an obstructionist Congress in the way the Republicans have, we're in deep trouble. On the other hand, if there's a group of people who have access to information and actually have their feet more on the ground in terms of mainstream information and don't just dismiss it all as liberal propaganda or the liberal media as if somehow there's this vast left-wing conspiracy, then we can get somewhere. So I'm kind of someone who overall is optimistic. For instance, in this election, Hillary Clinton's going to win. I hope she takes at least one house in Congress with her, the Senate perhaps, so she can get something done. I think in the end, the misinformation of the last 20 years of the right is going to partly fade on an age basis and a demographic basis as America becomes more brown and more black and more Asian and less white and lower middle class. People fade away just because they're getting older. Something may change. But in the short term, we've got a real struggle on our hands between what I would call the misinformation age and actual information. And that's kind of where the fight is, more than left or right.
I don't see eye to eye with Frank on everything. I'm certainly not as hopeful about Hillary Clinton's presidency, but I think we have a lot in common. We both sincerely want to understand the world better and not simply react to it. We both resist acting like a know-it-all, but we feel compelled to speak up against the people and ideas we know to be wrong. And therein lies the rub, as Shakespeare would say. Because no one likes to be told they are wrong. So how do you make the world a better place? God only knows. Join me next time for a discussion with political science professor Joe Uzinski. Joe is the co-author of American Conspiracy Theories, and a man with many thoughtful insights to share.
Thank you for listening to This Must Be the Podcast. Our host is James K. Lambert. Our music was composed by Steve Yeager, and I'm the announcer, Keith Kopatz. This Must Be the Podcast is a JamesKLambert.com production.
I don't know if you want to answer this, but for your wife, but how did your wife feel about going on this journey with you?
Well, actually she was delighted because I don't mean delighted at all the twists and turns, but glad that I got out. Look, she came from a liberal Roman Catholic, Democrat voting San Francisco lawyers family. I put it this way. It's as if I had been working in a fish packing plant and Jeannie had always hated the smell of fish. She never would have complained if I quit the job, even if we went broke for a while. And that's really how it was.